I try to use things that sound horrifyingly pessimistic as ways to make myself happier. I call it constructive pessimism or Russian optimism.
I absolutely love that.
I am a ridiculous creature. I'm just glad I know that about myself.
As impressive as resumes go, Greg Lukianoff is a constitutional lawyer, free speech juggernaut, and president and founder of FIRE.
I mean, there's no such thing as authenticity without freedom of speech.
Greg co-wrote one of my favorite books of the last decade and challenged me to a rather difficult culinary task. This is Last Meal, where I prepare the dish my guest would want if it were their last.
Sushi.
Yes! This is very important to me.
Okay, so tell me all about sushi and why this is your last meal.
Well, my dad always found it really funny that his kids, when they would get together, that we'd eat sushi. But that's because we all started working in Japanese restaurants when we were really little. I had a lot of great experiences and a lot of surreal experiences at a Japanese restaurant. And since then, it still is a thing that when my family gets together, we tend to eat sushi. Like it's a recurrent theme all throughout my life. So it makes me very happy.
I mean, did you ever cook any when you were working in those restaurants? Did you cook at all?
I did. I was a tempura cook, which basically means you sort of hang out over a fry-later, and you burn the hell out of your arms.
This is like great job for an 11-year-old. Let's put him in the hot
oil.
oil.
No. By then I was 14.
Oh, okay. Yeah, legal to be burnt to death. You're like...
Tempura cook was not the best job.
Yeah.
My whole family, we all worked at restaurants and we all like to cook. But sushi is one of those ones I've always wanted to kind of keep the mystery in it to a degree. So I've never actually taught myself how to cut it or do any of it because I'm like, nope.
Also, it's
magic.
It's impossible to master as well. I mean, I've seen these interviews with these sushi chefs that are 80 years old.
Have you seen Euro Dreams of Sushi?
Yes.
Yeah. It makes you want to be a better person.
It does. It makes you want to be a better person because you're like, what is my sushi? What am I not doing to the best of my ability
How could
every
I
day?
be amazing? Yeah. Can I be amazing?
Do you have a fondest memory as a child?
I'm a comic book guy. I'm really big on comic books. And anytime I could find 2 quarters and a dime, I would run down to the comic book store. And my dad was always surprised that I wouldn't get candy. I'd be getting comic books.
What were your favorite comic books?
I'm a big Avengers guy.
Okay.
Spider-Man, I feel like kind of raised me to a degree.
Yeah.
I love Avengers. I love Spider-Man. I actually love Captain America.
So then you decided to become the Captain America of free speech.
I'm no Steve Rogers.
No?
That's too high of a compliment.
Okay,
He's too good of a man. And of course, I was growing up in the 80s when it kind of seemed like, I describe it as free speech culture, like the idea that everyone's sort of entitled to their opinion, and free speech law were kind of ascending. And it went from increasingly being something more seen as sort of like a lefty value to a little bit more of a universal kind of American value over time. And so I went to law school, specifically to do First Amendment law. So FIRE actually found me to be its first legal director back in 2001.
Well, do you think there's an interplay between, free speech and it creating an environment where we can live our best lives?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no such thing as authenticity without freedom of speech. And I mean, when censors, what they're saying is don't be who you actually are. And my point, like my sort of more idiosyncratic free speech theory, is that it's important to know what people really think, full stop. And they're like, well, what if someone believes horrible things? I'm like, it's valuable to know the horrible things that they think.
Of course.
You're not safer from them for not knowing about them.
You can't defend yourself against bad ideas if you don't know what the ideas are.
That's true. But you also have an inaccurate picture of the world, and that's really, really key. And then people will bring up, well, what if they're like conspiracy theories? And it's like, it's really valuable to know. Like, this is the way I put it. Lizard people who live under the Denver airport do not, in fact, control the world. But knowing that your wife or girlfriend or uncle believe they do is really important information to have.
Yeah.
And conspiracy theories have changed history. Like that it's hard to understand some of the interwar anti-Semitism, in Europe without knowing how popular the fake manifesto, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was in the early 20th century. It's fake. But it's important to know that it was there and that it was influential.
You mentioned authenticity before, and how the interplay between, I guess, free speech and, you can't be authentic without free speech.
Yeah.
How important do you think authenticity is for us enjoying and being grateful for our lives?
Oh, I don't think we really can be we obviously can't be ourselves. We can't be as weird and wonderful as human beings actually are, and quirky and strange and ridiculous creatures that we are.
Speak for yourself.
I am a ridiculous creature. I'm just glad I know that about myself. But there's also there's sort of a deeper level to authenticity too, which is being able to talk about your problems. I think about my own depression.
Would you be open to talking about those periods of depression?
Yeah. I mean, I had bouts of depression since I was kind of pretty young. But the most severe one I had at first was probably in college at one point. But I did therapy, and it got to a point where it was not too bad. But then when I became president of FIRE back in 2006. It's a really hard job, and being genuinely nonpartisan means that we're pissing off left and right all the time. And I was living in Philadelphia. That's where the headquarters of FIRE is. And I'm more left-leaning, and I was, going to these Buddhist retreats and that kind of stuff. So I was dating a girl from one of those. And I remember telling her, she didn't really approve of the fact that I defended Republicans sometimes. And I remember saying to her, I'm like, I'm an old school ACLU guy. I think Nazis have a right to freedom of speech. I certainly am willing to defend Republicans. And she literally said, I think Republicans might be worse. And I was like, oof, okay, this is going to be tough. Meanwhile, on the right, twice in that year, a conservative tried to get in a bar fight with me over us defending people on the left. And it was just kind of and those are just the more extreme examples, but it just kind of, it was just chipping away at me to a degree to be in this nasty pressure cooker all the time.
To be under fire.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
And my doctor was prescribing high doses of a lot of drugs. I just got really suicidally depressed, really intrusive thoughts about killing myself. And I always, through all of my depressions earlier, I always had this rule with myself. I was never allowed to think about suicide. If it popped in my head, it was gone. And I think maybe it was the medication or something, but suddenly that door was opened and I couldn't shut it off. And it got so bad that I started going to all those suicide websites to try to figure out, if you're going to do it, what's the safest way to do it so you don't, wake up with your face half blown off, or, having the worst thing that would happen would be to have a suicide attempt and survive. So I was reading a lot of these things, and it also kind of made me a little bit more I see so many things through the free speech lens, but it's these suicide websites that people wanted to shut down in many cases probably saved my life because they were realistic about it. And so I got so bad one day I went to a hardware store, to buy, plastic to cover my head and get time, wire to put around my neck. So when I took all of my, all of the drugs that I had that I was going to grind up and, to poison myself, that if that didn't kill me, I couldn't, And I had a little flash of thinking, of having a little bit of maybe I shouldn't do this. And the thing that actually woke me up just long enough to save my life was when my brain, in response to that, said, no, but you have to. You have to do this because you might feel better later. And this is important that you do this now, because right now is the only time you're seeing reality as it actually is, and you need to die. And I was like, okay, that's messed up. And that little glimmer of some amount of sanity that was still in there caused me to call 911. And they told me to, get myself checked in. So I, walked to University of Pennsylvania. I nearly talked my way out when I was talking to the doctor, of not checking myself in though, because I got scared. And I remember him just saying to me, listen, Greg, before you go, can I just ask you one thing? Are you normally like this? And I just cried my eyes out, like it was just. And so I got myself checked in. Now, what's amazing is I did this over a holiday weekend. And or maybe it was just maybe I just like called out on Monday. And I this happened on a Friday night. I went back to work on Tuesday, without anybody knowing I'd been hospitalized.
Wow.
As a danger to myself, because I was so scared that if I couldn't hold it together for fire would die. If you told me anything good would have come out of that moment, I would not have believed you in a million years. And then I started studying cognitive behavioral therapy, which is more or less like a way that you look at your exaggerated thoughts and talk back to them and get in the habit of calling out when you're catastrophizing or overgeneralizing or believe fortune telling, which means you know what the future is exactly going to look like. And it doesn't work to just know it intellectually. You have to turn it into a habit. So you have to do it every day. And I did it every day for 9 months, wasn't really sure, like multiple times every day. And I had a great CBT therapist and all this stuff. And within 9 months of trying to kill myself, I was happy. And I just would never have believed that. But while I was recovering and studying CBT, I was working on defending free speech and academic freedom on campus. And I was looking at what was going on campus back then and looking at the way the administrators were acting towards young people. And I was kind of like, it almost seems like the administrators are saying, do catastrophize, do engage in overgeneralization, do engage in, they really are in many cases, do engage in fortune telling and blaming and all of these kind of bad mental habits that will make you anxious and depressed. But in 2008, the students weren't buying it. Like they weren't absorbing it, even though it seems like the adults in the room were actually selling it. But that was why when in right at the end of 2013 and going into 2014, when I started seeing students showing up who were really different than the students who had come before, started showing up, demanding disinvitations and speakers being canceled and microaggression speech codes and trigger warnings, which don't work. By the way, the research was exactly like Haidt and I predicted it would be. It was really clear to me that they were believing in all of the cognitive distortions that were going to make them miserable. So I had just met Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, who wrote a book called The Righteous Mind that I was a big fan of. And I told him about the idea of like, I think what's happening on campus right now, and this is in 2014, is going to be not just a threat to academic freedom and free speech, because these students are demanding, censorship, but it's going to be a disaster for their mental health as well. And that's how we got started on coddling the American mind.
It's amazing that coming so close to suicide, the one thing that you learnt from that was something that the opposite was being taught to an entire generation of people.
Yeah.
That's mental.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And it's one of the reasons why I've never liked the title Coddling the American Mind, because I wanted to call it Disempowered, because I really wanted to say, like, this is what we're doing to these brilliant kids. We are taking them and we are whispering into their ears that they are not as strong as they actually are. They are not as competent as they actually are. They're not as capable as they actually are, that they're more fragile than they actually are. Filling them with a profound sense of doubt and fear and the idea that they will be permanently wounded and damaged by words, and then being shocked that somehow they're anxious and depressed.
Words or ideas.
Or ideas, yeah.
Yeah. We know that the optics of social media have changed quite a lot since that generation of people that you were talking about, let's say 2013.
Mm-hmm.
Closer to what it looks like today.
Yeah.
And when you have a generation of people who have been disempowered to that extent, but they also might be under a few collective illusions, as we mentioned.
Yeah.
And then they all become broadcast journalists themselves. That proves to be an interesting landscape.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
Well, I think the role of social media, it's central to why 2014, both for the trends we saw in coddling of the American mind and for the trends we saw in canceling of the American mind. And our theory in coddling of the American mind was what was so different about the kids hitting campus around 2014. And the main thing was that they grew up using social media, and that created a lot of this distorted way of thinking. But for canceling of the American mind, when we talk about cancel culture as the uptick in campaigns to get people fired, expelled, punished, deplatformed, etc., for speech that would be protected, say for like a public employee, that was entirely the product. That was simply impossible before the existence of social media. And one of the things that was so great to write with Ricky, the Gen Z young woman, is that she grew up with this. She had a and it's very cute. She always feel like apologizes to her mom explaining this because she didn't know, but I did have a cell phone when I was 10. It was
born with a 5S.
Yeah. And a lot of people got them pretty early back then. But she talks about growing up with cancel culture, that essentially the ability to create the appearance of an angry mob trying to get you off the board, so to speak, was something that was really kind of perfected in some ways in grade school. And I remember actually talking about this one time when we were doing a podcast together, because we had long since decided the definition of cancel culture is basically beginning in 2014. And she just made a kind of offhanded comment like, oh, I think it's funny because, we say it began in 2014, but I grew up with it. And I'm like, oh my God. So the cancel culture techniques of figuring out ways to ruin someone's life or otherwise scare them out of disagreeing with you or get them fired or whatever, those are tactics that were developed in junior high schools. And so we're all arguing like a bunch of junior high schoolers now.
That's certainly what it looks like to somebody on the outside of all of that.
It's one of the things that we really try to lay out in Canceling the American Mind is that social media also brought with it a lot of ways of arguing that just aren't ever going to get you anywhere near truth. Ways that we talk about it as winning arguments without actually winning arguments. That essentially, cancel culture is the way you scare someone out of disagreeing with you or ruin their lives for disagreeing with you. So we talk about the efficient rhetorical fortress on the right, which we talk about as being kind of like being able to dismiss anyone you can label as being woke, or not having to listen to experts, journalists, or if you're hardcore Trump, anyone who's not pro-MAGA. But on the left, because a lot of this developed in academia, we call it the perfect rhetorical fortress because it's just layer after layer after layer of ways to not have to listen to each other. We call it fasc casting, that essentially magically turning someone into a fascist, even if they're a lifelong Democrat. It's ding. And you see this in action, and it's one of these things where it's kind of I'm left of center, but I get tired of saying that because it's one of these things and so what if I wasn't? Does that mean magically if my opinion wouldn't matter anymore? And I remember from even in law school in the late 90s, for a large number of people, the answer is kinda, and people who should know better. And then we take the readers down this sort of demographic funnel because so much of the left uses so many identity characteristics, whether it's race or gender or sexual identity, as ways to disqualify someone from having an opinion on any given number of things. Yeah. You are able to lose your identity characteristic or be told that you have internalized misogyny, which Ricky Schlott, my female co-author, has been told that she has a lot when people disagree with her. Internalized transphobia, internalized racism. And so the ire towards someone who nominally you would think would actually be given extra credibility, but if you're on the wrong side of these arguments, then you're in real trouble. And that's one of the things that makes it perfect, because you can't get past. And we're just on level 6 of the thing, and we talk about 14 different other ways to to dismiss people, and it's not going to get us towards truth. It's certainly not going to create friendships. It's just a brutal tactical way of not having to ever admit you're wrong about anything.
I can't wait till I get called able-bodied.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like it's on the horizon somewhere.
Well, Coleman Hughes gave a great quote for the book, which was like, I've often been told that my being black is central to the credibility of my opinion on any number of issues. But then when I actually give my opinion, and it doesn't match what oftentimes white people want it to, white liberals want it to be, then I'm told I'm not really black. And and he's like, it's just perfect. Like there's no way to defeat this.
Yeah.
And so keeping that quote in mind, we talked to basically every black conservative and a number of black moderate authors that we know. Asked them, have you been told that you're not really black for an opinion you have? Every single one of them was like, oh, yeah, absolutely, including John McWhorter, for example.
I know John's copped it, yeah.
Yeah.
If there was one thing about the world that you could change with the click of a finger, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to give two answers to this because if it's truly we're talking about magic, in the beginning of Canceling, we talk about the idea of there being a sorceress who removed our ability to engage in cheap argumentative tactics and to always take seriously the possibility we might be wrong and to argue towards truth. And if I could magically make people better at that, I think we'd be living in a much better society. I think we could solve any number of problems. I think we could argue towards truth. I think we'd live in a better world. And that's the nice thing about that is it's not something we actually do need magic for. We just need better intellectual habits. But sometimes it feels like the only way we're going to get there is magic.
Yeah.
The much nerdier and more sort of practical one is I got all my Democrat friends together back in 2003 to say, the Democrats should be refocusing on energy policy. And by that, I mean, like, we should be going big with big energy solutions. We should be doing, nuclear. We should be doing fusion. We should really be trying to figure out a way to produce tremendous amounts of inexpensive energy. And sometimes, like, how does this relate to, like, my passion for freedom of speech? And I'm like, a lot of us freedom of speech people get into this because we were really concerned about the scientific revolution and about the relationship between the freedom of speech and the scientific revolution and ideas, of the scientific method.
Enlightenment, even to an extent.
Yeah, because but the sheer number of problems that we could actually, I don't think people really fully grok like how much we could actually fix if we had vast amounts of cheap energy.
I totally agree with you 100%. What is something you do differently to everyone else?
I have a kind of funny answer for this. I call it constructive pessimism, or sometimes I also call it Russian optimism.
Oh, I'm going to like this.
Yeah.
What is this?
I try to use things that sound horrifyingly pessimistic as ways to make myself happier. And I remember explaining this to my wife at one point.
I
when she
absolutely loved it. Okay, sorry, go on.
To my wife, when I'm working on a book, books are hell. They're always difficult. Like, they're always harder than you think they're going to be. And I was working on my first book, and she was in graduate school. And I gave her this advice that really horrified her. It's like, no, honey, here's what you should do. I know you're working at your house often. It really feels all very bleak, and it just feels like a grinder. Here's what you should do. Imagine you're here forever. That this is the rest of your life. And she's like, what? Why? Like, imagine you're like in a work gulag and you're stuck there. And you'll be there forever. And she's like, how on earth is that going to cheer me up? I'm like, because then you give up a little bit. Then it's that hope, like to have like that additional, and it's also a little bit Buddhist too. It's kind of like, it's like in some ways like giving up on, like, it's that desire to be somewhere else that is actually causing you the pain at the moment. And here's the thing, if you can actually do, and I do little tricks like this to myself all the time, if you can actually do it, you give up a little bit, like the craving for things to be different, kind of ease a little bit, and you can just work your butt off. And then when you're out of it, you're like, I didn't think I was getting out of the gulag, And so it genuinely makes me cheery. She's like, I think that might just work for you, Greg.
Okay, what is the most sensible thing you've ever heard anyone say?
Like filling your heart with anger towards someone is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die.
I've heard that before. I want you to tell me what you think the most defining moment of your life was
Oh, yeah.
up till now. And then I would like you to tell me what you'd like to be remembered for.
Oh, man. So, Christmas when I was 4, I got a gift from my Auntie Rona, and I open it up, and it is a little plastic drum, and it's absolutely terrible. Like, it was this thing that you take it, and it's like tunk, tunk, tunk. Like, it didn't even make a drum sound. And it was cheap, and it was awful. And I'd never gotten a gift that I didn't like before. I was generally a pretty grateful kid, but this was a piece of junk. And I look up at my mom, and I'm like, I have to be polite. And I look at my dad, and I have to be honest. I have to be polite. I have to be honest. I have to be polite. I have to be honest. I have to be polite. And of course, I did what like any 4-year-old would do, is I burst out into tears. And I remember my older sister Katie, being like, "Oh, poor baby, he didn't like what he got for Christmas," and he starts crying. And I always joke that I wish I had better vocabulary at the time, because it's like, it's my first experience with a fundamental societal paradox. And it's funny because, like, being polite and being honest, like, at the time, I just always thought it was a funny story about remembering crying as a kid.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of like, holy shit, like my whole life, like a lot of what I would pursue in my career is about the greater importance of being honest than it is sometimes to be polite, because politeness is fine. Choosing to be polite, I think, is perfectly fine. But there are some times where it's much more important to be honest. And that's freedom of speech.
I like that. Mm-hmm. And what would you like to be remembered for?
Probably my knowledge of comic books. No, I'm just kidding. Defending freedom of speech, and I hope I get people to think about freedom of speech a little bit differently, and about the value of knowing the world as it is, and that it's simply impossible to understand the world as it really is if you have no clue what people actually think. And if the project of human knowledge is to know the world as it is, and it actually turns out it's very difficult. It's actually an arduous, never-ending process. That freedom of speech, that you can't reach that goal in a situation where people are too terrified to say what they actually think.
Greg Lukianoff, thank you so much for coming on Last Meal.
Thank you so much.
And let's eat some sushi.
Woohoo! Love it.
It's often easy to take the liberties we're afforded for granted. Greg reminded me that the lives we live are sometimes balanced precariously on vulnerable foundations, and that it would be foolish to take these for granted. And that's all from me.